Hello and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me today. It's great to be here with all of you. Great to see a good group of folks joining us today for this webinar. Wherever you are, I'm in New York, so it's early afternoon, but wherever you are, good morning or good evening. Again, great to see everyone here. Hopefully I can make this worthwhile and interesting for you. Of course, that's always my goal. My name is Robert Rodriguez. I'm a professional landscape photographer, printmaker, teacher. I've been a Canson Infinity ambassador for quite a while, 2011 or so. So on behalf of Canson Infinity, I'm happy to be sharing this presentation with you today called Crafting the Expressive Print. Please feel free to share your questions either in the chat window or preferably in the Q&A window. And I'll periodically look over and answer any of them that is pertinent to what I'm discussing. But at the end of the webinar, there'll be a full Q&A session where you can ask anything, ask whatever you want about anything, and we'll be answering there. I'm happy to have Jane Dixon with me tonight as well. She's the marketing director at Canson. She's also super knowledgeable, and she'll be helping answer questions too. So thank you, Jane, for helping me out. Okay, so with that said, let me jump right in. So when most of us think about printing, I think what comes to mind first is the mechanics, right? And I'm talking from a printer's standpoint, a printmaker's standpoint, the technical challenges, the plethora of papers that are out there, all the choices that you have to make when it comes to creating a print that looks good. And achieving that, right, making a print that looks good, that's an accomplishment, no question about it. And that's something that is definitely a skill that you can learn. However, if you stop there, then I think you're really missing out on the full potential of printing. And that's because I think once you get reasonably good at the mechanics, at the technical aspects, right, the software and the profiles and all the things that go into having the print come out the way you want it from the printer, that feeling wears off, right? Once you can do that, looking good isn't enough anymore, or at least I don't think it should be enough. What you really want is, I'd argue, a print that is expressive, one that does more than just put an image or photograph onto a sheet of paper. It shares something with the viewer. It's the kind of print that someone enjoys holding, not just for what they see or feel in terms of what they feel in their hands, but what they feel inside, what they're getting from the print. And that's the harder part, very much more difficult thing to get at, but it's also the most rewarding part. And I think it's the only part really that will keep you printing over the long term. You know, it asks a lot of you as a photographer, as an artist. You have to think about what your photograph is really about, and you have to choose a paper that complements that supports it, that lifts it. So today is really not going to be about the technical and the mechanics. I've talked a lot about that in the past, and I certainly will in the future as well. But it's more about the art, the aesthetic, the meaning in making prints. And what by meaning, I mean the meaning that you get out of your own images seen as prints, something more than just what you see on your screen. And so I'm also going to share some guidance, of course, about choosing papers, because that's always one of the most important aspects of this. Now, I'll say up front that I'm only going to scratch the surface here in 45 minutes or so, but I hope that you'll come away with some useful ideas, some good takeaways. I'll share some at the end, and a deeper appreciation of how much the paper matters, and specifically how Canson's papers can do that work for you. So let's start with, what is an expressive print? Well, for me, I think there are two levels here, two components. The first one is the aesthetic level, what you actually see. And then the second component is the artistic level, what you feel, as I mentioned before. So aesthetically, what you actually see, right? An expressive print is one that preserves the content and the form of your file, of your negative, of your photograph, right? So you want sharpness and detail where it's needed. You want the print to have the sharpness where it's preserving what's in your original file. You also want tonal depth, you want richness in the shadows or the highlights. Again, preserving and complementing what's in the image already. If your image has deep blacks, you want your print to also have that. If your image has beautiful highlights and so forth, you want that to be present in the print as well. You want the print to have ideally a sense of luminosity. For me, that means that when you put the right light on the print, it feels like the print has light coming out from within it. The opposite of that, or at least when we're not doing that properly, right? That's a print that feels kind of dark or dull or just doesn't feel like it's luminous. It's muted, and so forth. The other thing is that you want it to have a presence as a physical object, and that it's going to have that as soon as it comes out of the printer, right? Because it's something that you can hold in your hands. But the texture, you want the texture to complement what's in the image. The surface of the paper, that's also going to influence how good your print is. And when someone holds your print in your hands, right, it's the way they respond to the way they hold it. That's what makes it special above and beyond a digital screen. Now, these are all things that you will achieve when you're able to make prints that more or less match what's on your screen and you're reproducing the file, as it were. But most of that, if not all of it, is a technical challenge, a technical process. And that's something that I think anyone can learn. It's a skill, learning, having knowledge, working out the bugs, but nonetheless, quite achievable, I would say. The second level is the artistic or the interpretive one. That's the one where you convey an idea or a story in the print. It's the one that focuses your attention on the story, right? And away from the specific paper or the photograph itself. You're no longer like examining the paper to see what texture it has. You're getting pulled into the image itself and what it's trying to convey to you. And those two things together, the paper working together with the photograph, they become, in a sense, greater than just the sum of the two things together. They become something beyond what you see on your screen. It conveys something emotional, right? Your interpretation, the photographer's interpretation, made physical, made tactile, etc. And not just for what they see, but for what they might feel. The other things to consider in terms of this expressiveness, right, is the tonal weight, the richness of the blacks and the whites. Less or more blacks, that's got to be a deliberate thing. Contrast should be a deliberate thing, not just based on the original capture or on just some formula, as it were. The print needs to have a point of view, an opinion, right? Something that you can feel that decisions were made when crafting the image and the print and the print together, right? It keeps control of the viewer, right? Nothing is accidental. This intentionality is really important because when you're intentional in every part of your photography, that leads to making decisions that, guess what? They're uniquely yours because you're making choices. You're being intentional about those, and your choices are going to be different from someone else's. That'll make your images and your prints more expressive of you as a photographer, which is, I think, ideally what the goal is. The paper choice, as I said before, that the paper choice should complement and support the content, the composition, right? What the image is really about. And so this example here, I've got an image where it has a lot of texture in it. I'm choosing a paper deliberately that complements that texture to sort of project to the viewer the thing that I was responding to, that I was curious about, that made me make the photograph primarily. And so I'm choosing the paper along those lines, thinking about what is it that I want to translate or communicate to the viewer. Now, this is exactly what Ansel Adams meant when he said the negative is the score and the print is the performance, right? A musical score is instructions on paper. It's got the composer's ideas. He hears the music in his head. But like your original capture, maybe that's a film negative or a digital raw file, it takes you as an artist to bring that to life. That's the same with your interpretation that leads to the final print. So you're doing this not only in your editing and how you're interpreting the file, but also how you're then combining it with a beautiful piece of paper to produce this thing that goes beyond just what's on the screen, as it were. Now, another thing that I want to emphasize, and I've said this before, but I keep repeating this, which is that your file, what you see on your screen, is not the finished work. I mean, sure, it's the finished thing if you're going to share it on Instagram or social media or share it with someone else digitally. But we're talking about printing here and papers. And so the file on screen is not the finished thing. It's the potential. It has the potential for the finished work. And when you bring in the huge element of paper, that's going to give you potential to go even further than you thought you could before in terms of this expression that I'm talking about. So the monitor is kind of like a rehearsal, okay? And the print is kind of the finished version that viewers see in your club competition. You know, when you share your prints, the viewers don't see what it looks like in your monitor. They don't see it in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever. They're just calibrating themselves to what they see on a wall in a gallery or on the walls of your home or in a photo club competition, what have you. That's the thing that they're going to respond to, not how good it matches what your file looks like. You know, I've had many experiences where a customer will order a print from seeing my images online, and then when they finally see the print, they'll always say how different it looks in print, right? They'll say things like it's much richer, right? And by richer, I don't think they mean that the colors are more saturated or anything like that. It just has a richer presence, right? They'll say they feel more connected to the content of the image because it's physical, and that, to me, is a pretty amazing thing to evoke from a viewer, right? There's a bigger connection there than the screen. They'll also say things that, like they notice things that they never saw on the screen, little details or the way the composition works in a different way. And I think that's because the attention that a print demands is just way more than screen, right? It's got this physical presence, which for me is another beautiful quality of prints, especially in today where we're surrounded with, screens, etc. So if you stop at the first level that I mentioned before, the let's call it the aesthetic one, or just representing or documenting the scene, then I think you're missing out on the potential, as I said, for true expression. Here's an example of an image where I made the photograph and then I did some basic edits. And this is pretty true to what I was looking at, okay? I would say it's very accurate to what I was looking at. But accuracy is really just saying, does it match? And I'm not trying to match what I was looking at. I'm trying to express what I was thinking about, what I was feeling, right? My curiosity. And so I don't want to just match what I saw. I want to perhaps create something more. Expression asks, does it convey what I felt or what I want the viewer to feel? In other words, does the print become its own interpretation, independent from the file on the monitor? It's not separate from it. It's just taking it to that next level. The whole thing should be driven, of course, by, I would say, your vision, right? The thing that made you excited to make the picture in the first place. That excitement doesn't come across when you just press the button and just show out of the camera. That excitement has to be something you put in, because now we're talking about emotions, and emotions are that ephemeral thing that you have to somehow translate into how we see and how we look at things. And I think that's where you gain the expression. So again, the faithful versus the expressive version, right? You can think of it like technically it's fine, but it needs to be emotionally alive, as it were. That mindset shift that you're not just reproducing a scene, but that you're performing an image. And just to be clear, I don't want, expressiveness isn't about how much editing you're doing to a file. In other words, more editing doesn't necessarily mean you're improving the image. Sometimes your editing should be restrained, right? Less is more, as they say. So let me share two example images, how I edited them to, I think, create the expressiveness that I'm after, and then how I printed them, including the papers that I chose. I'm going to show you the two images first and my workflow through them, and then I'll jump over to my viewing station, and then we'll do the fun stuff and show you the actual prints, and of course the papers that I chose, and maybe I'll share a few other prints as well. So this first image is one that is a scene that's local for me. I actually made this with my iPhone 17 Pro, The reason for that is because basically, what's the phrase, right? The best camera is the one that you have with you. I visit this place all the time. It's the Hudson River, about 2 miles away from where I live. I walk my dog there. I've been there hundreds of times. And so I wasn't really out today to make photographs. I was just out to walk my dog. But when I saw the conditions that day, I thought, wow, this is really a special scene, a special moment, much different than the way it normally looks. And so I thought, well, let me see if I can capture the essence of what this feels like. And I had my iPhone with me. And of course, I'm thinking about that's the best way to get the best file out of the iPhone. So I'm shooting in RAW, DNG files, trying to limit the amount of processing the iPhone is doing so that I can do the most of the processing afterwards. You know, this is a quiet, calm, serene, kind of atmospheric on the Hudson, and yet this is a fairly busy place. The composition tries to convey that with the alternating areas of texture and softness leading up from the bottom of from the bottom all the way up to the wispy cloud. So for me, the image is about a moment of calm, as it were, with all of the energetic, even chaotic environment around it, right? It's just this little moment where things were just still and calm for a moment. So this is, again, as I said, the raw capture, no adjustments whatsoever. The first adjustments that I made, or the basic adjustments here, are tonal optimization. By that I mean making sure that my white point and my black point is where I want them to be for what's in the image. Okay, I don't want a super solid white point because I want to maintain sort of the softness and the wispiness of the clouds back here. And I certainly want a deep enough black point to ground the image, particularly where the deepest shadows are in here, but not so dark that it makes it overbearing. The rocks aren't where your eye should land and stay. The rocks in the foreground and the middle ground are just places for you to continue to move up from the foreground up into the sky. So they're steps, not only taking you from bottom to top, but also from foreground to background, establishing that depth that I felt when I was there. I adjusted the temperature a little bit to make it slightly warmer, just to kind of bring in that little light that's just starting to peek through the clouds, and you can see it in some of the rocks in the foreground. Particularly, you can see it over here. And I also did some saturation to the blue primary in Lightroom. You can do this in Photoshop as well. That adds a little bit of warmth to the light. I did some slight darkening to the blue channel, mostly to make the clouds stand out a little bit more cloud separation. So lowering the luminosity of the blue channel, it's kind of like a virtual polarizer, but just a little bit, right? The point of this image isn't the clouds. The point of this image is moving you from the foreground up to the clouds. It's using as I said, the entire composition, not make the clouds the most important thing. So I want them to remain soft and distant in the background. The other thing to that point is that I used very little, if any, texture or dehaze in the image. And that's because I don't want to put any of that back here. I want that to remain kind of soft and just apply it in the foreground. So the last step that I did in the editing was create a mask in the foreground, basically from about here down. And that mask adds a little bit of warmth and clarity for depth and dimension, just in the foreground, leaving the background, as it were. That just creates a greater sense of depth into the distance. All right, and that's the finished edit right now. I think this is a perfect example of editing with restraint. I didn't need to do more to the image. I needed just to do the right things to make the image evoke the kind of atmosphere and presence that I wanted. And so what you don't emphasize sometimes is, or always is, as important as what you do emphasize or bring attention to. Now, one approach is not better than the other. I'm not saying always edit with restraint or always edit aggressively. It just depends on the image and what you're trying to do, how you want to interpret it. Knowing which one to use is the art and the thing that I think really matters at the end. Okay, let's go to one more image here. This is a much older image. I made this with my Canon 1DS Mark III full frame camera. I think this is 155 millimeters or so. I mentioned that just so that's the focal length. I like long lenses for scenes like this because they compress the scene and create the the sort of the form that I want in the image. I don't want it to be like a deep landscape. I want it to be more about really feeling in the scene, immersive in the scene. Now, there are a few things going on in this image for me. One is the gesture and the pattern of the trees, right? That's what caught my attention the most. It's also the way they're almost moving and dancing with each other, some in the back, there's one over here. And because there's this sort of lingering fog in the background, it creates this wonderful atmosphere and sort of mistiness to the image. That light also is kind of on the softer side, not a harsh light. And so that I like what that's doing to the trees in the foreground. And I love images where you can have this transition between like atmospherics, softer, more clear in the foreground and softer in the distance. For me, it adds this atmospheric quality that I really like. At the end of the day, it's about, for me anyway, it's about the gratitude, right? The gratitude of experiencing nature during moments like this where you least expect them. So that's the original raw file without anything done to it. Here are my initial adjustments. Again, optimizing for tonal range, right? Lifting the whites just a little bit, adding more black just to add a little more contrast. You notice that I adjusted the temperature to cool it off a bit and making a little more balance between foreground and background. But at that point, there was something about just the feel of the image in color that wasn't really working for me, or wasn't giving me what I was actually after when I was there in the scene. It wasn't about the color. It was about just the trees and their gesture and this atmosphere in the scene. And so that's when I decided to interpret the image as a black and white for more, I would say, graphic or photographic feel. It's, as I said, the gesture in the trees and the relationship, etc. The color wasn't really doing that much for me. And so that's many times when I'll think about, can I interpret this in a different way using just tone versus having the color. Now notice that I didn't say convert to black and white. You might think that's just semantics, but converting, it's kind of just like removing the color. Interpreting means that I'm trying to carefully choose how the original colors are going to get translated to the different tones so that I get the look and the feel that I'm after in the image, especially thinking about what I'm going to do next to the image, one that also suits the composition. So I typically will try lots of different camera profiles in Lightroom, or you can do this in Camera Raw or any good RAW editor. And the different profiles the black and white profiles will change, camera profiles, these will change how the image is being interpreted from the original file to a black and white translation. And as many you can pick from, I'm trying to pick the one that gives me the best foreground background separation. You notice that it darkened the background a bit so it's not so bright. It made things a little bit less contrasty for the moment. This is the one that I chose in terms of the profile. Now, the next step was giving the image some life now, giving it some depth. So here I used the tone curve to add depth in the shadows. I like the tone curve because you can control whether you're adjusting the highlights or the shadows individually or independently. And so I wanted to add more depth, but leave the highlights as they were because I don't want the image to be bright or too bright. I also used the black and white sliders, again in Lightroom, but Adobe Camera Raw has them as well. The black and white sliders allow you to adjust the various colors in the original image to determine how light or dark the different tonalities are in the image, how bright things are. So notice the foreground brush is a little bit brighter. There's a little more background variation. Things don't look like they're all sandwiched one thing on top of another. I also brightened some of the leaves that you see hanging from the trees. And that's just by adjusting for example, the black and white slider for green makes the leaves brighter because the leaves were green in the original color image. And then the final step is the all-important dodging and burning, which I don't use in every image, but many images I do. And here the dodging and burning is really important. So I'm adding a mask on the one side of the tree to brighten that. Same thing over here, same thing over here. There's another mask that is, continuing with the dodging, right? I'm also dodging the most foreground areas of the brush here to just make it move forward a little bit. I'm adding a few little highlights here to some of the leaves, very sort of selective dodging, maybe over here, maybe a little bit over there, just to, again, add some variation. Tonal variation just gives a sense of depth to the image. And then I burned a few things, darkened, right? I'm darkening the other side of the tree. That gives the tree more depth, more roundness. Over here, that's a little mask there. Maybe darken a few spots in here, maybe in here, just to separate these layers. So there's a layer of brush here, and then there's another layer back here. And then you finally got the distance back here. But even these little things here, I'm darkening just ever so slightly, again, to create a multi-layered image. But still, notice that because this is all soft back here, because of the fog and because of my aperture, I think this was f11, it lets it recede into the distance, and it really makes the trees and the thing that I was attracted to remain front and center. They have all the presence. They're the main subject matter, as it were. Okay, and so here you see the original capture, if you want to call it that, but that's not what I was thinking in my mind. This just shows the camera capturing the light and the scene, as it were. But in my mind, what I was thinking and feeling, the thing that drew me away from what I was looking at to the scene, that's what I'm trying to convey in the photograph. And the black and white with the adjustments that I showed, I think that's really much closer to what I'm trying to convey. Now, before I show you the actual prints on my viewing station, let me just review a few basics of paper selection, just in case, because I will be talking about the different papers, a few different papers. And after you've got the image looking and feeling the way you want on screen, the most important thing is choosing the right paper, okay? The mechanics of the printing profiles, the settings, all that stuff is important, but which paper, right? And the most important principle here is the difference between Dmax. That is how much black a paper can hold. A high Dmax paper, typically like a darkroom paper, that's what we call them, glossy, luster, satin, Baryta. A darkroom paper is going to be able to hold more black. It's going to look and project a more aggressive, punchy, photographic look and feel. This is where we start to talk about the kind of feeling that the print is going to evoke, hopefully, from the viewer. A matte paper is going to have lower Dmax compared to any darkroom paper, and that lower Dmax is not a bad thing, it's just a different thing. It's going to give a softer, a more quiet, more painterly, suggestive kind of feel to the image. And so you can have the same image and create a different interpretation based on these two categories of papers. The biggest category, darkroom, high Dmax, high contrast, relative to matte papers, lower Dmax, softer, quieter feel. Of course, within each category, then we have some differences like the amount of texture, how bright the paper is. Darkroom papers will have different substrates, whether it's cotton or Baryta, etc. But none of those are as visibly consequential as the amount of Dmax that the paper has. That is going to be the most. That's going to do the thing. It's going to provide the biggest difference in terms of how you're telling the story with the image. Okay, so let's jump over and let me show you a few prints. Okay, so the first one that I want to show you, of course, is the first image that I edited, and there's the matte version, and here is a version on Baryta, actually platine fiber rag. So platine fiber rag here, and this is Baryta Photographique matte on this side. Matte paper and platine on this side. And the paper that I think works best and the one that I think is the right choice is the Baryta Photographique matte. And I'll explain why. By the way, the difference in density here in Dmax is not that great, and that's because Baryta Photographique matte There's a matte paper that has a special coating that gives it a lot more density than your normal matte paper. And I chose that for a particular reason. I love the density, the blacks that I get around the rocks here in the shadows, but not so much, or not as much as the way they are here. Here, the rocks are really too present. They're really taking over the image. And that's because the darks and the blacks here, the contrast makes them heavier. It adds more visual weight to the foreground, more than what I want. Over here, you'll notice that it's a little bit softer, a little bit more suggestive. However, I went with the Baryta matte because it still has that wonderful textural presence that I like. A normal matte paper, like rag photographique or something, might have worked, but I think the Baryta matte just gives you that little bit extra, but still keeps it from being as heavy as it is over here. Also, the Baryta Photographique matte has that wonderful matte finish. You see there's no reflection whatsoever, and it really maintains the softness of the mist and the clouds and the fog in the background really nicely. Whereas the Platine, it gets a little bit, for me, a little bit too aggressive. As I said, it's shinier, so that shine is something that I don't like often with images like this, where I just want to have this sense of atmosphere and a softness about the image. So Baryta Photographique Matte 2 is my preferred paper for this image. The next image, one of the trees, and this is Arch 88, a beautiful matte paper. And on this side, good old Baryta Photographique 2, a wonderful darkroom paper. However, here you can see the differences, I think, much better than with the last pair, because here we've got just a regular traditional matte paper, not the Baryta matte that has that extra, just a little bit of extra Dmax. And here you got the Baryta Photographique, which has the most amount of Dmax. And you notice that on this side, again, that black, that extra contrast adds a certain weight to the darks that you don't have on this side. On this side, it just looks and feels a bit softer, a little bit quieter, a little bit more suggestive. And that's really what I'm after. I'm after that more softer feel. The background is fog. It's got this atmosphere to it. On this side is a little bit too photographic for me. I prefer, again, the softer feel to the image. Arch 88, which is Canson's smoothest paper. Smooth is important here as well. I mean, this paper is smooth also. All darkroom papers are smooth, but on the matte side, I could have chosen a paper with texture, but I went for the smoothest paper because I've got differences here in texture. It's important that the background remain as smooth as possible so that the texture in the foreground has a chance to come forward. It creates more depth and dimension in the image. Whereas if I had used a paper that had texture in it, the texture would have complemented the trees, no doubt, but the texture would have also sort of reduced the separation between foreground and background from a textural perspective. It would have added texture in the background and taken away from just that fog that it feels like you can just stick your hand through it and there's nothing there. So that's how I think about texture. Once again, low Dmax, high Dmax, that's the most important thing to keep in mind. And that's why I think Arch 88 works in this image for me. Now let me share just a few more examples of images so you can see the decisions in terms of the type of paper. This is Rag Photographique 2. And once again, this is Baryta Photographique. And this is, I think, a great example of the opposite of what I mentioned before. Rag Photographique 2 is a matte paper, lower Dmax. Baryta Photographique 2 is a higher Dmax paper, more photographic, more aggressive. And for this image, for me, the Rag Photographique is the one I prefer. in this sense of talking about this sense of expressiveness, right? The simple reason for that is because this image is about the light, specifically about that energy in the light, the strength of the light, the warmth of the light. And both papers do a nice job with the light and the color, but only the Baryta Photographique gives me those deeper, stronger, more foundational blacks, and the blacks make the light more pronounced. Whereas on this side, because the blacks aren't as deep, the light isn't as strong. That difference, as nuanced as it is, gives this print more of that feeling of the energy, where at one moment there was no sunlight and the next moment the light is hitting me in the face and it's creating this wonderful warmth that I can see and I can feel. And the darks here, the shadows, help to make that light much stronger. So for me, a high DMAX paper here, the Baryta Photographique 2 is my choice. As I said, all darkroom papers from Canson have no texture, extremely smooth, and so that works fine as well because we've got some water here, sky. It keeps everything nice and smooth and even in terms of no texture there. Here's another example in the reverse again. That is to say, on the left is the matte version. On the right is the darkroom paper. On the left is Rag Photographique 2. This is Canson's updated version of the original Rag Photographique, and what it adds primarily is just a little bit better in the blacks, a little bit increased DMAX. And for this particular image and the print, I prefer the matte paper. Why? This is Baryta Photographique again, but here, notice the Baryta Photographique delivers those wonderful deep blacks. But if you look at the image, if you look at the composition, if you look at how I'm trying to move the viewer through the picture, I don't need the blacks here to be so strong because they sort of create a place where you kind of get stuck. So much contrast here. I want to keep the viewer moving over these landforms like it's a wave. And on this side, the blacks here are a bit softer. They're more subdued, more painterly, as it were. The blacks don't pull you in like they do over here, and they allow you to keep moving through some lighter midtones here, and again, less of that contrast here. It's not about staying here, it's about all of the repetition going on through the image. And this applies, by the way, to any image you're making. It doesn't have to be a landscape. It can be floral, it can be a portrait, it could be a cityscape. But think about where your blacks are, whether the blacks are creating the whole foundation for the image, in which case you might want to use a high DMAX paper like the previous example, or whether your darkest blacks are just a stepping stone and part of moving the viewer through the image, a variation in tone, in which case the deepest blacks over here might not give you or might diminish or compromise the composition in that way. So again, I like the Rag Photographique here on the left. One more example. On the left, Rag Photographique 2, once again, one of my favorite papers. And on the right, we have Platine Fiber Rag. Well, all of Canson's papers are my favorites, but the ones that I use the most often, right, tend to be the less textured papers like Rag Photographique or Shady 8 BFK, because lower texture for me generally works better. Here we have, again, low DMAX, high DMAX, Platine Fiber Rag, and Rag Photographique 2. Now, I will admit that in the past, I printed this image and preferred it on the Platine Fiber Rag because the matte paper just left something lacking in these deeper shadows in the foreground and the darks in the tree. However, I've been reprinting, every so often I will reprint images, particularly when a new paper comes out, just to see how the paper has changed, what's improved. And the Rag Photographique 2 has convinced me that I think I prefer this image now in the Rag Photo. Why? Because the darks now, I think, are enough to make the image work. And the matte paper gives me something that the platine doesn't in this case, which is that softer, more painterly kind of suggestive look, very quiet, right? It's a certain kind of mood and feel that I want. And on this side, yes, the darks work, the contrast works, it's all there, but it feels a bit forced. It feels a bit louder than what I want. And so again, if you look at this print, it's got a beautiful surface, but it's definitely, you know, volume is pretty high. Whereas on this side, there's just a certain restraint about a matte paper, and this paper in particular, the rag Photographique, beautiful gradation, works beautifully. The color, everything is captured, and yet it maintains this softness. Now, you might ask, why didn't I use a textured paper, assuming that I had a textured paper that would give me the blacks I want, because I have a lot of texture in the foreground. Well, look at that sky, right? Oh, that big blue sky, that needs to be soft and way in the distance. I don't want anything in here, like on this side, to interfere with the viewer moving through the image. They can move all through here, but nothing really is going to distract them there. They're going to come back to where the actual detail in the texture is. So in this case, we're always refining and evolving and learning and taking advantage of new tools, in this case, new papers. And I think right now I'm just preferring the way that image feels to me in terms of this expressive quality. Okay, so I said I was going to share a few takeaways at the end, and I think these are hopefully the most important things that you can think about, work on, use it as a way to rethink how you're printing. First one is, as I said before, accuracy is the starting line. You definitely want to be accurate. Let me switch over here. Sorry about that. There we go. Accuracy is the starting line, but you want to print for interpretation. And I think you saw me doing that, right? Think about how you're interpreting the image, not just being faithful to the way the thing looked. You want to see deeper. Your monitor is your reference, and it's an important one for sure, but your eyes looking at the print, that should be the final judge, right? And not necessarily holding it up against your monitor. You can do that at first just to make sure that your reference is good. But once you know that your reference is good, that everything is calibrated properly, that you got the mechanics down, right? Then I will glance over at my monitor. If I see something that's a little bit off, then I'll say, wait a second, the colors aren't quite right. But otherwise, you want to judge the print itself. How does it stand on its own? Paper, the paper is your most expressive tool when it comes to printing. And so that's really important, as I've shown you before, right? Learning the differences between those two categories, the lower Dmax versus higher Dmax, and then within each category, the various differences that will make the papers complement your image in a way that you want. And by the way, I'll say, even though Canson has a pretty nice range of papers, a dozen or so, for the most part, I don't use 14, 15 papers and select between those. I've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 papers that for the most part fit my style, and that'll be different for you. But this way I've got 2 or 3 papers, maybe a smooth matte paper, a matte paper that has some texture on it, like a BFK, and then I've got a darkroom paper, and those 3 or 4 papers pretty much cover almost any situation that I might be in terms of what I'm trying to say with an image. For you, it might be different. Your photography is different, but I'm sure that you can find that core handful of papers that will work for you. Having said that, right, printing the same image many times is the only way to learn. In other words, take the same image that you now see on screen, and then you have to print it over and over again with the different papers, and that'll start to show you how not only the print, but how the effect of the paper changes. And that's the most direct way to learn versus trying different images, because you're changing the variables there and each image is different. It's its own thing. And then finally, get feedback on your work. This is important for any stage of your photography. Having someone else look at your work, look at your prints, and suggest things that you might not see for various reasons. We're all biased. We're all have our blind spots. I often miss things that I should be seeing and somebody else will see. I often call someone else to help me out and say, hey, what are you seeing here? Or what do you think? Feedback is great. It doesn't mean that it overrides your convictions necessarily, but it's another data point that you should use. So the only part of printing that will keep you printing is the reward, right? From making something with your unique point of view. And that includes, as I said, collaborating, I would call it, with a beautiful Canson paper. The best way to learn, or one of the best ways to learn, is to get a discovery pack from Canson. Discovery packs are, you'll find a bunch of different papers in there, and you can print the same image. I would suggest printing the same image on all the papers, and then you'll learn more about the papers and your photography this way than honestly any other way I can think of. There's nothing like a print really showing you exactly what's going on with your image, your composition, your approach, your edit, etc. It really doesn't hide anything, but that's what you want. You want to know everything that's going on so that you can improve and learn and move forward. All right, any questions from anyone that they'd like to ask on what I've talked about today? I don't see any questions here. Any questions at all from anyone? I don't know if that means that I've covered everything or that you're not sure of what to ask, but I do not see any questions, so I suppose that's a good thing. Not a question, but a comment. Thank you. I love your talk. Well, thanks for that, Rob. I talk slow. Yes, I guess I talk so that I understand what I'm saying. That's the key. What are the different steps in order to choose your paper? I would say that that's a good question. I would say the primary steps are, number one, first kind of understanding what you're dealing with, right? So if I asked you to choose a lens, you'd say, well, how do I choose a lens? What am I looking for? What are the things that are going to be different between lenses? And so I would say the first thing is, honestly, get a discovery pack, pick an image that you think would be a good example to print with. I would say one that you're familiar with, an image that you very familiar with the colors, and it's something that you've worked on. You're happy with that image, and then print it on all the papers. And then look at those prints, not just then, but over a period of days or weeks. Lay them out and just examine them, and then you'll start to notice things about the prints. Some things you like, some things you don't like. If you're not sure of the differences, then do a little research or what have you. And I mean just visually, like higher contrast is going to give you a different feel and look than a lower contrast paper. And then once you start to develop a sense of, okay, I see what the different papers are doing to the image, then you can say, okay, I see what high Dmax is doing versus low Dmax. And when that becomes a little bit familiar to you, then the next step, right, is looking at your subsequent images and trying to think about, okay, this image that I have here, how do I think it would look on a high versus low Dmax paper? And that's how you start to make these choices. Everything in steps, just like cameras or lenses, right? And once you start getting fairly, I would say, comfortable with at least making a decision, not that it's going to work, but you're getting comfortable with, I think this will work better on a high Dmax paper. Let me try it. Once you practice that enough, then you can start to say, okay, I feel like I prefer matte papers more often than not. What's available in matte papers? How can I extend the choices in matte papers? And that's when you start getting into things like more texture or less texture. But I would say that comes later. You want that to come later, just like a camera and a lens. First you buy that basic lens, and then you start realizing, I think I need a longer lens. And then you're going to get that longer lens. You don't buy all the lenses at first, because then you'll not know when and how to use them, okay? Can you address warm versus cool papers? Yes. So there, I want to make sure that I differentiate between warm and cool and brighter and less bright. Okay. Canson's papers, and I can only speak to Canson, Canson's papers aren't necessarily warm or cool. In other words, the warmer papers aren't toned or anything like that. It's just that if a paper is whiter, then it'll look like it's a little bit cooler, but it's just a brightness level. Almost none of Canson's papers use optical brighteners, aside from the RC papers and a little bit of natural OBA that's in the Baryta surface of Baryta papers, but it's not added to the papers to make them whiter. And so because all the papers in essence are naturally what the whiteness would be, plus how they manufacture the paper, some papers are going to be a little bit whiter, and that makes them appear to be a little bit cooler. But I assure you that if you take, let's say, rag photographique and put it next to, well, if you put rag photographique next to platine, it may look like rag photographique is, quote, warmer. That's because you're comparing the two things. But once you take the Baryta away and you just look at the rag photographique by itself, it looks perfectly white. And this image that you see on screen here, that's a matte paper. That's a rag photographique, which will appear to be warmer next to platine. But by itself, you wouldn't say that paper is warm. It just looks, it's white. It's just not as bright, say, as one of the darkroom papers. Which paper do you recommend for everyday multi-subject use? Yeah, Lester, thank you. That's a great question as well. So I generally suggest that you pick up, if you want to use Canson, and I hope you do, you pick up the RC papers. The Canson RC papers, Photo Satin, Photo Luster, are more inexpensive than the fine art papers. They do have OBAs. They're not archival. They're not going to have the same museum grade longevity, etc., as the fine art papers. However, they will give you the same amount of DMAX as the darkroom papers. There are no RC matte papers. They're just darkroom papers. So they're going to have high DMAX, but they will give you the same DMAX. And so that means you'll be able to experiment and see how your prints look. And the RC papers are a great way to learn. Of course, to really get the nuance of the fine art papers, you have to use those. But I always say the RC papers are a great way to get your feet wet, as it were. And they're still great papers. Some of Canson's RC papers have won awards and things like that. And if you're not looking to hang your prints in a museum or a gallery, you want them around the house, they're not going to fade after a year. They'll last you quite a bit of time, and a great way to learn. Right. Thank you for those questions. Got a little worried there. Great questions, everyone. And if no one else has any questions, I just want to mention that if you want to go much deeper into everything I've covered here, you can check out my Creative Path Academy. It's a membership site where I do live monthly interactive sessions like this, showing you prints, talking about editing, many other topics. We have a dedicated print lab session where monthly print lab session where we go in depth on papers and editing and all those kinds of things. We spend time in composition, visual storytelling, etc. So again, if you join, you get access to the live sessions which occur multiple times per month, the entire archive, past sessions. There's even an AI companion that helps you find stuff, content that I've produced over the last couple of years. And if you have any questions about printing, as well as points relative to the Academy, then you can also explore that as well, right? I'll leave a link in the chat, and you can check that out at your leisure. All right, thanks everyone. I hope that works out. There will be a replay on YouTube eventually. You'll probably get an email, but I can't tell you exactly when, but hopefully you'll watch it again. And even if you don't join the Academy, please feel free to reach out, send me an email. I'm always happy to answer questions. I want to share everything that I've learned from others. I want to pass that forward. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.